The fragile situation in the Middle East has escalated sharply as the region moves closer to a wider confrontation following new strikes and counterstrikes involving Iran, U.S. forces, and Israel. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has hit a U.S. base in Kuwait in response to American operations along Iran's southern coastline, while Washington maintains its focus on securing key maritime routes, including the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, indirect communications have been suspended, with Tehran accusing the United States of enabling Israeli military actions in Lebanon, where civilian casualties continue to rise and entire areas have been heavily damaged. Meanwhile, U.S. air operations have resumed in the region, adding further pressure on already tense maritime corridors where naval activity has increased and commercial traffic has been disrupted. Diplomatic reactions remain divided, with international forums meeting under growing criticism over their inability to enforce ceasefire conditions or halt the escalation. To understand the scale of this crisis, its regional spillover, and the implications of the recent Trump-Xi diplomatic engagement, we put questions to our panel on All 24 News Special shortly. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special coverage on the war in Iran. And before we bring in our guest, let's follow this report, then we get back to discussion.
Behind the screens, Tehran appears as a bustling city moving through its ordinary routines, yet in its crowded streets and daily conversations, doubts linger and speculations grow over the fate of the nation and a region hanging in the balance. In one of his latest statements, US President Donald Trump said Iran wanted to make a deal, but amid renewed exchanges and mounting tensions, those remarks have done little to dispel the fears of war. For the Iranian citizens, a deal with the United States to end the conflict is unlikely, with many believing that a potential agreement would not be beneficial for the Iranian people.
I think given the broken promises the US has made so far, this will not happen. The negotiations are merely an excuse for another war, for further encroachment on the country's territory, and they will not lead to any result.
Trump is pursuing his own interests, and in my view, an agreement with the United States will not be beneficial for the people or for the country.
The Trump administration has toughened its stance, demanding, among other things, the complete elimination of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile and the unconditional reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran has condemned these demands as excessive, accusing Washington of backtracking on its previous positions.
The enriched uranium we have belongs to us. The nuclear energy we possess depends on it. The Strait of Hormuz is like our uranium, like the rest of our land. It is our legitimate right. It belongs to us, and no one has any right whatsoever to have a say over it.
For Iran, unlike Washington, an agreement should extend beyond the nuclear and Hormuz issues to include the lifting of economic sanctions and ending the Zionist aggression against Lebanon. Accordingly, statements coming from Tehran repeatedly emphasize distrust of diplomatic rhetoric, insisting that only tangible actions can establish trust.
All right, let's bring in our guest joining us tonight to unpack this complex web of military escalation and strategic double standards are four distinguished international analysts. First, we have Dr. Ibrahim Al-Marashi, a Middle East historian and geopolitical analyst. He joins us from Rome, Italy. Hello there, Professor, and thank you for agreeing to be with us.
My pleasure.
And we're also honored to have Mr. Ognjen Petronjovic, a political analyst, joining us live from Belgrade, Serbia. Hello there, sir, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Karim.
It's our pleasure. And back to our screen is Mr. Christopher Isayu, independent international affairs analyst and consultant. He joins us from Boston, USA. Good to see you, Christopher.
Good to see you, Karim. It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me on again.
Thank you. And we are honored as well to have Mr. Mohammed Krissassi, geopolitical observer and financial analyst. He joins us live from New York, USA. Hello there, Mohammed Krissassi, and thank you for being with us again.
As always, a pleasure to be with you, Karim, and your distant guest. Thank you.
Amazing. All right, let's start the debate with you, Dr. Ibrahim Al-Murashi. So let's begin with the historical context of this diplomatic collapse. Iranian Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf stated that the relentless bombing of southern Lebanon constitutes a war crime that Washington is actively permitting. So, from a historical perspective, how has the U.S. repeatedly used the cover of fragile ceasefires to allow its regional proxy to expand its military parameters? And is the U.S. now fundamentally bound by Netanyahu's escalatory agenda, according to analysts and observers?
So let's not forget, we're almost coming up to the year-long anniversary of the so-called 12-day war. That war that occurred in the summer in July 2025 almost followed the same pattern. The U.S. seemed like it was in negotiations with Iran, and then Trump proudly claimed that it was a cover for Israel to launch its attacks on not only Iran and its nuclear facilities, but then was followed up by an American assault. That's just recent history. What's going on in Lebanon? Let's not forget, in 1982, Israel launched a ground invasion of Lebanon, reached the outskirts of Beirut, and this is what led to the emergence of Hezbollah in Lebanon. This is what led to Iran developing Hezbollah in the first place. So there's the long history and there's the short history in the mind of the Iranian political elites.
Mm-hmm. And now, how would you explain what analysts are saying that the U.S. agenda is tied to its Middle East ally, Israel, especially in the covering up of the war crimes of what people are claiming to be war crimes in the region?
You know, there was a close relationship between the Biden administration and what Israel did after October 7th. But what is happening with the Trump administration and Israeli kind of military actions is unprecedented. This is a direct military cooperation. It's a direct military campaign. So, in other words, it is not enabling Israeli actions through the shipment of weapons. It is in direct cooperation. It's military action in tandem. And this is what is unprecedented in America's history in terms of its relationship with Israel, this nature of cooperation. Never has what Trump has allowed is a cooperation that's never occurred in American-Israeli relations.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's bring Mr. Ognian Petronievich to the discussion. Mr. Petronievich, the UN Security Council met in an emergency session regarding the systematic leveling of Lebanese historic sites like Tyre. Yet they concluded with the typical Western formula that Israel has a right to defend itself. Now, how is this blatant double standard viewed by international audiences outside the Western bubble, particularly within Eastern Europe and the global South in general?
Thank you so much for that question, Karim. It is very important to kind of shine a light on this side of Europe as well. Since I'm from Serbia, I would like to start out with the current state of affairs with relations between Serbia and Israel. I kind of work my way up your question. Well, at this current moment, the relations between Serbia and Israel have been based on military cooperation and diplomatic engagement. That was very much facilitated with the fact that Serbia is trying to pursue this policy of four pillars, foreign policy of four pillars, and that is essentially relying on United States, Europe, Russia, and China. And with this arrangement, this package of having good relations with the United States, this also facilitates the relations between Serbia and Israel. They have been developing their military cooperation to another level, and I think that Vučić, our president, was the only, this is his word, this is what he said essentially, he was the only European leader who was sending weapons to Israel during the Gaza crisis. And this definitely resonated with the Serbian audiences and also Western audiences, Eastern audiences in terms of Europe, of course. So to put it in this way, I think it is very important to understand why this relation is structured in this way. And for this, we have to dive deep into the history and go back to the Yugoslav war. Tehran was one of the actors in international relations that financed the war in Yugoslavia, in former Yugoslavia, especially financing Muslim majorities within the former Yugoslavia. And this kind of developed itself even today. This is essentially the root of the problem, and I think this is one of the factors why Serbia has good relations, government relations with Israel. On the other hand, this is also resonating with the audience in a way that Tehran and Belgrade had similar interests after the 1999 bombing of Belgrade, of Serbia, through NATO intervention in Serbia and former Yugoslavia, which was, so to say, completely illegal. It was against and contrary to the United Nations Security Council resolution. And in that sense, it was completely illegal use. It was a complete illegal use of force in international relations. So Serbia, in a sense, kind of suffered from this, and the Serbian audience definitely felt betrayed by the West in this sense. And so to say, nowadays, this also has consequences on the broader audience views, especially when it comes to Israel, especially when it comes to the war in Gaza that was happening a few years ago. And this blatant double standard policy practiced by the West definitely left consequences on the audience to understand them as, so to say, hypocrites and losing their credibility. Nowadays, I think that majority of the people, everyday people in Serbia, and young intellectuals, students, and so to say conservatives as well, are definitely against this cooperation that the government is holding with Israel. And with the current crisis in our country, political crisis, legitimacy crisis, it is very likely that this political view of the audience will translate into a new government, new form of government that will definitely change their stance towards Israel.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Now let me move to Mr. Christopher Isayu from Boston. Mr. Isayu, let's speak a little bit inside the American establishment. We see a massive contradiction. For example, Secretary of State Marco Rubio is demanding a unilateral halt to Hezbollah's defense operations before Washington halts its own aggression. How can the U.S. Establishment claim to act as an objective broker when its leading diplomats perhaps parrot the exact talking points of the Israeli military command?
I'm not sure if I would agree with that that depiction of the situation. I think that definitely this is an unpopular word domestically within the United States. I think that you can't really speak of the U.S. Political class and establishment as a unified whole, because there's definitely a schism between the still, rather impotent Democrats, most of the MAGA voters, the independents, the Democrats, and more moderate Republicans. And even within the MAGA, even within Mr. Trump's own cabinet, there's, reported schisms between himself, J.D. Vance, and other things. So I don't think you could depict that as a unified whole. Mm-hmm. That being said, I think it's been a complete disaster in terms of communication in general. It's not a popular war. Congress was not consulted. It's still not being consulted. Most American people do not stand by this war, and gas prices are going up. So really, it's not a popular war. And I think Mr. Trump is looking for an off-ramp and a way to end it where he doesn't lose complete face, because essentially, Iran was able to de facto close off the Strait of Hormuz, and also, the United States expended a lot of munitions and still didn't, take away Iran's nuclear stockpile, which was the putative, one of the major, casus bellum reasons for this war. So I think that it's not a popular war at all.
Yes, and since it's not a popular war, we can see that Washington is facing pressure on multiple fronts, Mr. Isayo. So how much of the current strain is rooted in the way Donald Trump administration is balancing domestic political messaging with its wider foreign policy commitment?
Yeah, definitely. Good question. I would say that it's a disaster. I wouldn't even give it that much structure, Kareem, to be perfectly honest. Donald Trump has very famously said recently as maybe 10 days or 2 weeks ago, when asked, do you care about the average Americans' cost of living, prices at the gas pump, when you are factoring in your calculations about the Iran war? And Mr. Trump, as his usual, nonchalant, non-caring style, brushed it off and said, not at all. So that's a communications disaster right there. The second part of it is that the initial reasons for going to war that were communicated to the U.S. public have changed. They've changed in the last, 3-4 months since this has been going on. And even as recently as now, they don't even really talk about it anymore, to the point where Mr. Trump, I think, because he realizes that after the midterm elections, he could be a lame duck and maybe even be subject to, more impeachment hearings like he was in his first term. I think he's really just almost ignoring, to his detriment, the American public as a whole, which again does not want this war. The majority of Americans do not support this war. Even within MAGA, there's criticisms of Trump being a puppet of Mr. Netanyahu in Israel and doing Israel's bidding. Sort of the MAGA verse is split right down the middle with all the conspiracy theorists and those types of people. So, I don't think his communication strategy has been very good at all. But that's the nature of his cult of personality. It's all him. No one else is allowed to mitigate.
Amazing. Thank you, Mr. Christopher Isayo. And now, since we're dealing with the perspective inside the United States, it's only relevant to bring in Mr. Mohammed Chris Sassi, but to look at the economic aspect. Let's look, Mr. Mohammed Sassi, at the immediate financial and security ramifications. The IRGC has just retaliated by striking a U.S. airbase in Kuwait because it was used to launch American operations against Sirik Island. From a risk analysis standpoint, Mr. Mohammed Chris Sassi, how severely has Washington compromised the security of its sovereign Gulf allies by turning their territory into launching pads for an aggressive war?
Yes, it's an excellent question, Karim. If you take your scenario as a giving that U.S. air base in Kuwait was used to support operation against Sirik Island and that the IRGC retaliated by striking that base in Kuwait, the immediate risk implication is that the conflict now has expanded from a U.S.-Iran confrontation into a threat environment affecting all the Gulf state. To answer a question from a risk analysis perspective, several points here have to stand out. The first one is host nation exposure rise dramatically. When a country like Kuwait allows his territory to be used for military operation, adversaries may view the associated facilities as legitimate military target, regardless of wherever the host government directly participate in combat decision. Then that means that countries hosting U.S. force can face missile and drone attack against base, like we saw it a few days back, cyber attack on government and critical infrastructures. This is what happened when Iran was doing it. Disruption of port, airport, and energy facilities. We saw what happened in Bahrain as well as Oman, as well as United Arab Emirates, and increased domestically security pressure. Of course, now the GCC country, the economy based on investment, specifically in tourism, they are not now that country that people are going to go. And needless to say that the structure of investment and to put back their economy again and again after all this destruction is going to take years to do. Then the risk, in risk term, to get back to the risk term, the host state threat level increased because it become part of the operational geographic of the conflict. This is where you have a distinction between the ally of the United States and then what become a battlefield. And that remain very difficult. It's one of the main security benefit Gulf states seek from hosting US before that US force and to have a deterrence. But there's the presence of American didn't play the role that they're supposed to play to protect these countries. However, once active combat begin, then is the total, how can I say, carte blanche to attack all this host country, because the benefit that is supposed to have from the US military presence, it was reduced to not peacetime, but to be aggressive because they were hosting. And the cost of it is during a war, those same assets can attract, of course, retaliatory attack. And this is, as I was saying before, America attack Iran, then they go to their base in Kuwait and other. This is very, very difficult to handle. But unfortunately, this is the chaotic state of Mr. Trump. And again, I would like to go and reinforce the point that your predecessor was saying. Despite the causality of the economical disaster, not only for the GCC country, it's war trade now country. And Trump did his war not because he wanted to do it, because he became the puppet of Netanyahu. And as I said, each and every time I will reiterate here, Iran was the target of Israel for a false pretense of, in the beginning at least, nuclear power. We know that they didn't have any. Now we found out that Israel is a warmonger. And Mr. Trump, who said, I'm going to be the peacemaker of the world. I will stop the Ukraine war in one day. I will stop the Iran contract with Obama in 2 weeks. Look here, we enter in a third month of war. The world is a disaster, and the economy, as an economist, everything happened, never happened before. All the element of analysis, we cannot look at it like you used to do it. I'm sorry if I take too much of your time.
Thank you. Very insightful details. Now, let me bring Dr. Ibrahim Al-Marashi. Dr. Al-Marashi, Iran's negotiation team has officially frozen all indirect talks and message exchanges with the US via intermediaries due to the atrocities committed in Lebanon. Although just earlier we had a social media post on Truth Social by Donald Trump saying that the negotiations are still intact and ongoing. However, historically, does this mark a definitive shift where regional actors realize that engaging in diplomacy with Washington is entirely futile because the U.S. executive branch is structurally incapable of honoring its commitments?
Well, let's remember this has been a sticking point in the Iranian-U.S. negotiations since the beginning of the ceasefire that was brokered by Pakistan. And even the Pakistani mediators said the ceasefire included Lebanon, yet Israel has yet to adhere to that agreement. It has no incentive to. It doesn't really have a reason to, because for all intents and purposes, the Trump administration is not going to force Israel's hand in Lebanon. And it's for this reason that you mentioned the futility of Iran trying to negotiate a regional peace, is that for all intents and purposes, while Trump claims to control Netanyahu's behavior and Israel's policy, it has been unable to do so, and I don't think he's been willing to expend the political weight necessary to do so.
And now let's move to Ognian Petroniovich. Mr. Petroniovich, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaya Kallas recently visited Pakistan and praised Islamabad's mediation for preventing a total global war. Is it not deeply ironic in telling that European leadership must rely on non-Western nuclear powers like Pakistan to manage global stability, exposing the complete diplomatic bankruptcy of the traditional Western alliance?
I would not necessarily frame it in that way. First of all, I would like to point out two positive things that this visit brought. And the first one is the change of the European posture towards the peace talks, towards the negotiations. They have been very, very passive since the beginning of the war. They have been advocating for diplomatic solutions. And now when we have diplomatic negotiations happening, they were absent from the negotiating table. This kind of speaks about, European capacity to develop those mechanisms in international relations that will allow them to act proactively. With lack of leverage, I think this is definitely the step in positive directions to be in the center of this diplomatic arrangement for that will depend on that the whole Middle East actually depends upon. So to frame it this way. Even though Europe said multiple times that Iranian war is not their war, they have been suffering consequences, and they definitely need to change their approach, and they definitely need to be to move from the passive observer towards a proactive diplomatic actor, and this is a step in positive direction. On the other side, the second positive thing that came from this visit was the fact that Europe kind of understands, from a geopolitical perspective as well, the fact that we are going towards a multipolar world. This is the world where Western powers, big, great powers, will not be the single actors in revolving around diplomatic relations, diplomatic arrangements, military powers, but also there are some middle powers who will take the initiative like Pakistan did. And I think that the visit of Kaja Kallas to Islamabad was suggesting this, that Europe understands that these military powers, these nuclear powers that are not necessarily Western, geopolitically, they will now take the lead. And Europe recognizes this, and I think they praise these efforts. They also praise the fact that these states are advocating for peace, which is, again, on the European agenda. I would not use harsh words like diplomatic bankruptcy to describe the relations between United States and Europe, but Europe is definitely not in a good position, and this single visit is not going to change a lot. It's not going to change their position. They still need to do a lot more to actively engage. They need to develop leverages. I mentioned in one of your interviews that the idea of lifting those sanctions on Iran and also unfreezing the Iranian assets in Europe could be a positive direction. Could be a step in a positive direction for Europe. But what we are seeing right now is not the collapse of the Western order. It is more an adaptation to the world where countries like Pakistan, but also Turkey, Gulf states, not to mention Russia and China, all have the real geopolitical power, the real agency, diplomatic effort.
Amazing. Since you mentioned China, let me pitch this question to Mr. Christopher Isayu. Mr. Christopher, as we discussed before, I would like to address Donald Trump's high-profile visit to China. Reports from within the American foreign policy establishment indicate widespread opposition to his approach, with many arguing that the U.S. is fighting a lost war in the Middle East at the expense of its own strategic competition or rivalry with China. Here, within this broader strategic framework of US-China competition, how might Xi Jinping actually have gotten the upper hand over Trump? And what does this suggest about the shifting balance of influence between Washington and Beijing on the political or a global stage?
Thank you, Kareem. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, I always say, or maybe it's kind of a stereotype, that the Chinese play the long game. I think that, Xi Jinping, well, it's a dictatorship, so they don't have term limits. So that's one part of it. But he's much more looking beyond just Trump and beyond just the Iran war. But whenever China can paint itself as a reliable partner and an honest broker, which for, other than under realpolitik sort of, auspices or outlook, it's really not an honest broker, because China has its own aggressive, anti-democratic foreign policy interests. But as long as China can portray itself and de facto come across as an honest broker or a stable mediator, whereas the United States, as some of our esteemed colleague panels here have alluded to, the United States is not viewed as an honest broker, neither in the Middle East nor in Europe. As we know, with the Ukraine war, Trump's diplomatic efforts have been a complete disaster. He's rewarded Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Putin's illegal war of aggression and genocide against the Ukrainian people, while putting maximum pressure on the victim, Mr. Zelensky, and the Ukrainians, who are actually ironically turning the tide of war against the Russians. But he's been a complete disaster there. He's been inconsistent there. He's inconsistent about the Iran messaging. He's not really clear as to one of the biggest problems is that the Pentagon and Mr. Hegseth, the Secretary of War, are still lying to the American people as to the extent of the damages that Iranian drone strikes have inflicted on U.S. military assets. So getting back to China, I think anytime Mr. Xi Jinping can portray himself as an honest partner and the senior man, if you will, in the negotiations between Iran, United States, and the other, great powers, quote unquote, then it's always going to look better for China than for the United States. I think what is also interesting is how President Putin flew over tail between his legs right after Trump's visit, not to be outdone by Trump, and was essentially really shown as the junior partner, and really shown as kind of a feckless, no longer great power by Xi Jinping, very much on purpose, very much to show Mr. Putin and the world that China is in control, and China has the cards, as if you will, as the famous saying that Mr. Trump put to Mr. Zelensky.
Amazing. And now, Mr. Mohammed Krissassi, let's get back a little bit to economy. So we have this report. CENTCOM announced that the U.S. Navy, specifically the USS Milius, is executing a severe maritime embargo, having already blocked or rerouted about 118 commercial vessels. In retaliation, Tehran is threatening to fully close the Strait of Hormuz and activate the Bab el-Mandeb choke point. As a financial analyst, tell us plainly, can the fragile global energy market withstand a synchronized dual chokehold closure? And isn't this economic suicide for the West?
Well, from the point of view of an analyst, economical analyst, like I call myself humbly, a political economy perspective, you have here a simultaneous disruption of both the Strait of Hormuz as well as the Bab el-Mandeb. This will represent one of the most severe maritime energy shock conceivable in the contemporary global economy. However, wherever it will constitute a systemic collapse, as you said, for the West is a separate question. And here I'm going to elaborate a little bit my stand. You have here a conceptual framework. The two checkpoints serve different but completely, or I should say complementary function. The Strait of Hormuz is the principal export route for Gulf oil and the LNG. Bab el-Mandeb connect the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea, and ultimately to the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean market. Therefore, you have a synchronized closure that will therefore affect, number one, the physical energy flow, and it's very important for the route. The shipping cost an insurance market. The last evaluation are the number projected by the economy, the Wall Street and the Economical Guardian. They talk about 45% increase. You have the commodities future market that is going already affecting not only European. America, as I said many times, they don't import oil. They export. So they are influenced, but it's more on the speculation side, not on the real side, that it will affect Asia, for example. I'm not talking about China. I'm talking about all of Asia. They get 90% of the resourcing from that region of the world, which is and passed by the Strait of Hormuz. And then you have also the global supply chain. When you put the gas in your tank, when you put the, your industry, all this energy, and this is going to affect the price that me and you are paying at the hand. So the supply chain is going to be affected. And then, of course, the investor expectation and financial stability. One of the most elements for any economist is the country risk. And here we are facing a huge country risk with a country that serves more than 50% of the world in terms of oil and 90% of the passage of the tanker oil. So you have here distinction between, as I said, the flow disruption and also the production destruction. A checkpoint closure impede transportation and it does not necessarily, as I said, eliminate the underlying oil and gas reserve. And of course, the energy market, the effect. Oil, as I was saying, Hormuz closure will immediately place a substantial share of globally traded seaborne oil export of the risk. That's number one. And then, of course, the causality, the indirect causality is what? The oil future will spike, the volatility and this economical and this will rise, the strategic petroleum reserve will become central policy tools, and it's going to be a lot of speculation on that side. And lastly, but not the least important, is the government will likely implement emergency coordination measures. Remember 1970, or remember 1982, remember 1986, 2001. All this today is there in one shot, and for the last 3 months, when the other takes months and months and months, or years. So the market response to conclude on this is, how I said, you have a dual checkpoint crisis will likely propagate the channel of inflation, monetary policy, equity market, and my goodness, how the West can stand it. Academically, I should say, when you listen on all these classes that we do have and you share with myself with my newspaper and conference and the student at the university, you have several structure factors that make the contemporary Western economy more resilient than during early years oil crisis. Why? Because now we have a greater energy efficiency, we have a larger strategic reserve, we have now, which is very important, and we have to talk about it more often, the diversified energy sources. And of course, more sophisticated financial and logistics system to pay that. And I'm not going to talk about the sacrosanct dollar. We talked about it before. So again and again, we have the critical variable duration. But in my risk analysis, I don't know if it will be a short disruption of weeks or more dangerously, it can be a very long outcome, which will bring a recession risk, a bigger inflation, and of course, in disruption. The
impact can be felt everywhere in the world, of course, not just the West that is going to actually feel the pressure. And speaking of the pressure, the military escalation highlighted, according to analysts, the failure of Western deterrence in the Middle East. And here, Dr. Ibrahim Al-Marashi, I ask you, the IRGC announced that new defensive fronts are being activated, expanding their military umbrella to directly include the territorial defense of Lebanon. So how does this evolving doctrine of pan-regional defense fundamentally dismantle decades of Western colonial containment strategies in the Middle East?
So, that axis of resistance, I think the IRGC could make that claim right after October 7th, but when you had the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iraqi militias such as Iraqi Hezbollah, Harakat Nujaba, were all working in tandem and were either striking Israeli interests. And then let's not forget Syria was part of the axis of resistance. But really, I think that network came undone first with the assassination of Hezbollah's head, Sayyid Nasrallah, and Hezbollah was never able to find a successor as charismatic as Nasrallah. Of course, Syria is no longer part of that axis. So all that Iran has are the Iraqi militias and the Houthis, and it's still undetermined how much Iran can influence the Houthis, how much are they acting autonomously. So, that claim was valid up to a point, but, at this point, nobody is really coming to the aid of the Lebanese, and Iran at most can do is raise rhetorical concerns, but Lebanon's just a small nation without anyone to defend it. Ironically, the French created the borders of Lebanon and made it so small that is unable to stand on its own, with France now not really doing anything to come to its aid.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. And now another question to Ognian Petroniovich. Mr. Petroniovich, Iranian military advisors recently pointed out that whenever a sovereign state in the region undergoes Western mandated disarmament, such as Iraq, Libya, or Syria, it is immediately met with invasion and territorial balkanization. In contrast, let's look at North Korea. Is Western policy inadvertently proving to the global majority that absolute asymmetric military deterrence is the only actual guarantee of the state's survival?
Well, thank you so much for mentioning all of those cases. They are definitely an example of Western dominance, but the times have changed. The world has been evolving, and the single polar world, unipolar world, has been changing into a multipolar system, which kind of finally exposed the limits of Western influence, the limits of Western dominance. Their actions, like you mentioned, Syria, Iraq, but also you mentioned balkanization. So we can go to the root of the problem and mention Yugoslavia as well as one of the first victims of this Western dominance. So the actions of the West oftentimes resulted in loss of credibility, and this over time chipped away. And I think this is also the reason why we have this picture of the West right now, have this idea of the West right now as not a credible actor, actually as a hypocrite, in a way to say. With the decline of Western dominance comes a new international order. This international order is not solely based on international institutions like United Nations. It is not prioritizing human rights. It is not prioritizing international law, but is actually constructed on the principles of force and power. The absence of rules means war of all against all, as Hobbes would say. And this is the world, my dear Karim, I'm afraid of living in. I'm afraid of a world where you need to develop a nuclear weapon to guarantee your security. This is a bad example for other countries, for small states and mid-states. The fundamental challenge for the international community today is therefore not simply managing rivalries between great powers. It is actually restoring confidence that sovereignty, security, and political independence can be protected through rules and institutions.
Amazing. Let's move now to quick rounds of questions as we have only 5 minutes left on this special coverage. Now I move to Mr. Christopher Isayu. Mr. Isayu, President Donald Trump took to Truth Social today to boldly declare that Iran desperately wants a deal and that things will go very well. This narrative, however, is completely detached from the reality of active combat on Kashmir Island and rocket fire in Kuwait. How deep is the fracturing within Washington between Trump's populist rhetoric of ending endless wars and the reality of his administration escalating a catastrophic war?
Yeah, thank you, Kareem. Very good question. Well, I think again, it's a question of credibility and Trump's miscommunication and his ever-changing casus bellum, the reasons for the war to begin with. So, first of all, Trump's political brand initially started in both his first term and in his current term as the president of peace. I will solve the Ukraine war in one day. Well, he's failed to do that for a variety of reasons. Even up until he started the Iran war, which is his war of choice, people thought at least he was against the forever wars and the forever wars in the Middle East, especially, which Americans are just quite frankly sick of. My brother was a veteran of Iraqi freedom, and they're tired of wars in the Middle East for whatever reason. With the regime in Iran, yes, it's a brutal dictatorship. Yes, they butchered 20,000 of their own people back in January, but that was only one soundbite that Mr. Trump's administration used back in February, and it very quickly fell off. And Mr. Trump is not known as someone who particularly stands up for human rights. So I think that the consistency of the messaging has been problematic. When you add to that inflation, the disruption of global commerce, the fact that Iran produces fertilizer for Africa and the rest of the world, cheap fertilizer prices for that have gone up. The heartland of America, the farms, prices for farmers have gone up. So everyone that Trump initially courted in the last election that voted for him, he's essentially betrayed. So it's the reality of the messaging and the reality on the ground are two different things. But that's nothing new for Mr. Trump. He's always been sort of a president and a man of cognitive dissonance, and he's always been a bold statement maker.
Thank you so much, Mr. Christopher Isayo. And very quickly, Mr. Mohammed Chris Sassi, as we are reaching the end, only 1 minute left. Mr. Sassi, we see Kuwait has issued a sharp diplomatic rebuke, asserting its full right to protect its territory while condemning the violence. When the U.S. weaponizes the sovereignty of a small Gulf nations to project perhaps its own military power, does it not destroy the local investment climate and accelerate the flight of global capital away from dollar-denominated assets?
Well, I'm going to be very short. To tell me I have 1 minute, I have to say that the international political economy perspective, the question is not whether military activity affect financial confidence. Of course it does, but how investors assess the risk when host state become associated with the military confrontation. And this is exactly the image of Kuwait. And now they can be sorry about what happened to them. For me, it's unfortunate what happened to them, but this is the price that you are paying when you host a country that for the last 50 or 60 years do only war in the Middle East and try to destruct whatever government in the Middle East try to raise. I always said, the 1953 of Mossadegh. I talk about, the Iran in 1979. And I can go that, Trump, who used to want to be the president of peace, and he went to Nigeria, he went to Venezuela, he went to Greenland, he went to associate Canada. How can you trust this and his military? As I always said, and I will conclude on that, I am Algerian. My country was under the colonization of France for 132 years. It was the second or the third military power at that time. Yes, we pay a very, very heavy price. 1/3 of our population was killed between 1830 and 1870. Still, in 1954, we stand up, we continue the revolution, and we win. Why? Exactly like the same of the Iranian people.
Thank you, Mr. Mohammed Chris Sassi.
And resilience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have reached the end, so we have to wrap it up here. My profound thanks to all our guests, Dr. Ibrahim Al-Marashi, Ognian Petroniovic, Christopher Isayu, and Mr. Mohammed Chris Sassi. Thank you all for all the sharp insights.
Thank you.
So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The unfolding crisis in southern Lebanon and the Persian Gulf makes one reality undeniably clear. The era of uncontested Western dictate has reached its historical limit. As our panel highlighted tonight, Washington's insistence on enforcing unilateral conditions while turning a blind eye to the destruction of sovereign nations has exposed the profound bankruptcy of the Western rules-based order. With Iran halting indirect negotiations, the IRGC expanding its defensive perimeter, and the Global South seeking alternative economic architecture following the Trump-Xi summit, the United States appears to be fighting a losing battle, sacrificing its own strategic stability to sustain an aggressive regional proxy. Whether the international community can step in to halt this march toward the abyss depends entirely on replacing the hypocritical frameworks of the past with a genuine acknowledgement of regional sovereignty. So thank you, dear viewers, for tuning in to our channel, and until next episode, take a very good care of yourself and take care.